just going to briefly introduce Michele. Tihami has been part of the Gridwise family for way too long, Michele. Maybe not long enough in one sense, but for a long time. We appreciate all the work she's done with us and for us over the years. She started with IBM and went to CenterPoint Energy and now is with DNV and leads their energy work here in this country. So, Michele, thank you for being here, and I'll let you introduce your panel.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. How's everyone doing? Good. Ready for data discussion? Yes. Awesome. All right. So, and I apologize for not including my info before. So, thank you for the intro, Steve. Michele Tihami. I run the energy group in North America for DNVGL. Just in case, I know a lot of people say, who is DNVGL? We say Kima, so a lot of people recognize that brand. But we have a history, 150-year history. And we have a really awesome mission of safeguarding life, property, and the environment. And we take that to heart in everything we do. In my group, we focus on anything customer. And you can imagine that anything customer, central to that is the data, right? So my group, we are stewards of your customers' data, and then we also certify to PII issues, any of the ISO certification. So we help companies adapt to that in other parts of our organization. So data is really important to everything we do, and it's an issue that's part of our purpose. This? Oh, this. You're awesome. Thank you. We'll just scoot that over. Yeah, so the group today that we have brought on stage, it's really fascinating. We were talking about it outside. So here, as a consulting company using data, as a utility, Wendee is going to talk about what it means to be frontline center on bleeding edge, making these trade-off decisions. And then Tom's going to talk about what it means from a policy perspective and where we are and where we still need to go. So that's how we're going to, and then we'll leave time for questions. But that's how we'll tackle it. So with that, let me introduce Wendee. Go ahead, Wendee.
So I'm Wendee Hilderbrand. I'm with Hawaiian Electric, and I am in the legal department. I wear several different hats, but for purposes of today, I'm the data security and privacy lawyer as well as the company's privacy officer. So I'm always concerned with how we protect our data, both in terms of our critical infrastructure information and protecting the company from hacking incidents, although I'm not an IT expert, and we have a whole department that focuses on the IT elements. But I look at the policies and policy questions anytime anybody's looking for an exception to the policies, data sharing policies, that kind of stuff. I'm the one that makes those calls, as well as protecting our consumer data. And I also represent our customer service department. So I have kind of a unique perspective because when we step awry, either real or perceived by the customers, I'm usually the one that it escalates to. So I know firsthand how the customers feel about our use of their data and how our customer service call center gets inundated when we step afoul of that. So always trying to prevent that from happening.
Awesome. Thanks, Wendee. Go ahead,
Sure.
Tom.
So and thanks for the intro. Tom Hassenboehler. I'm with the Energy Consumer Market Alignment Project, which is a new nonprofit here in DC that's focused on kind of that intersection of digital technologies and consumer demand and trying to harness that consumer demand in a way that can drive new market-oriented policy solutions, basically. And I was motivated to start this thing. I'm kind of a creature of DC. I spent most of my career as the chief counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. Also did some time in the Senate, and I worked in the natural gas industry before that. So I have been around some of the debates when we used to have real debates in Washington around energy and environmental policy. It's been a couple of years since that has actually happened. But as you'll learn, I'm an optimist, and I actually do believe we are entering a stage where we're going to have a lot more things coming back to the federal government for some solutions, and I think there's a large opportunity here with data. I mean, data transparency. We're living in an age of just enormous change of data, and people's expectations are changing by the day. Certainly, if you're a millennial, you have a different kind of sense of privacy than you do if you're not. You put a lot more information out there. So when it comes to energy and climate solutions, there's a lot of opportunity here in this space, but there's just a lot of roadblocks, frankly, and there's a lot of policy uncertainty. There's a lot of state-by-state kind of patchwork things, and then there's a lot of need to protect the consumer in this space. And so that's sets up a very dynamic conversation with a lot of different players, which is what we're working on helping to do here in DC. So.
Awesome, thank you. So data has been part of our civilization, right, from the beginning of time. But what's different now? And clearly, just the abundance of data. No longer do we have filing cabinets. Well, some of us still do. But now, we make our own data. And then just with all the appends, new data is being created constantly. And it's ubiquitous. So what's going on now that hasn't already been addressed? And, maybe, Wendee, you start off, talk about what's going on in Hawaii, and then you can kind of add Illinois and California to that to show how, really trying to get to what's the problem statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously the biggest change in the electric field from a data perspective is the advent of smart meters and the collection of interval usage data. And that's the big change there is twofold. One, it's communicating that data remotely, whereas in the past it's been analog meters. You had to have a meter reader go out to the house to read somebody's usage. Now it's communicated remotely. So you've got two dangers there. From a consumer's point of view, you've got both of them are hacking dangers. From a consumer's point of view, everybody worries that they're being spied on when you've got data being transmitted electronically. So we've got to assure them that these devices are safe, that they meet certain certifications, that they can't be easily hacked. We've got to work with our vendors to make sure they can't be easily hacked. And then from our perspective, we've got to make sure they can't be easily hacked because obviously the electric infrastructure, the electric grid is, everybody's concerned about terrorists being able to use that by hacking in, and you can imagine what they could do if they could turn on all the PV systems at the same time or turn them all off at the same time and cause the grid to surge. I'm not an engineer, but I'm told bad things would happen if we turned them all on at the same time. So clearly it's something we're concerned about from a grid regulation perspective. Then the second concern is just actually having the usage data and knowing down to the minute, as opposed to you use X amount of electricity per month, you use a little more than your neighbors, a little less than your neighbors. If you're doing something illegal, maybe you use a lot more. That could show up, but once we can monitor your electric usage by the minute, we can tell a lot more. There are some companies that have algorithms that can detect what appliances you use and therefore what appliances they could market to you. And obviously that concerns some consumers. I happen to think the more dangerous concern is that they can, if it got into the wrong hands, they can tell your patterns on when you're home and when you're not home. Probably more dangerous would be when the neighborhood is particularly empty of people and therefore more of a theft target. So those are the big concerns I think we're seeing in the electric industry that have changed dramatically over the last few years that weren't a concern. And I'll just emphasize, especially in Hawaii, because we do support the Pacific Fleet and every branch of the military. I think the island's about a third military. And we just won a contract to privatize the Army's grid out there. We're particularly concerned about hacking. So when you talk about all of the additional data, of course, all of that data is electronic. And so we'll always be concerned about protecting it and making sure that it stays private and confidential and not accessible to somebody who might misuse it to shut down the island's defense systems.
And why don't you go ahead and talk about all of the stakeholder engagements that you've all done to kind of get to where you are today?
Yeah, so we have a pretty robust information assurance department. We were fortunate enough that the individual that was pivotal in developing the FBI and the CIA's data security, cybersecurity program retired in Hawaii and still wanted to keep his mind active. So our chairman of the board recruited him to Hawaiian Electric and got him to set up our department. So we were very fortunate to have him for a while and have a very robust cybersecurity defense program. From a privacy perspective, and before we rolled out smart meters, we had stakeholder workshops, several days of stakeholder workshops. We put together data access at our Public Utility Commission's order. We put together a data access and privacy policy framework. They wanted us to model it after California and Illinois, but obviously take into account differences that we had with our customers in our state and make sure that it was DataGuard compliant. We are one of the only utilities we were the only one last time I checked. I hope we're no longer the only one that's DataGuard compliant with the DOE's DataGuard program. And our Public Utilities Commission is very concerned with us staying compliant. So they wanted us to take California and Illinois' smart meter privacy framework, alter it as needed for Hawaii, and make it DataGuard compliant, which we did. We rolled out a draft to all of our stakeholders, customers, business customers, residential customers, the PUC, the consumer advocate, various consultants we knew would want the data for energy efficiency programs, gave them a couple of weeks to comment, invited them into our offices, had a couple of days of workshops where we went through the program literally line by line and took all of their feedback and comments and incorporated as much as we could, sent out another draft, allowed a couple more weeks for comments, incorporated additional comments before we filed it with the Public Utilities Commission. So we haven't gotten any pushback. It's still pending with the Public Utilities Commission, but we haven't gotten any pushback, and I attribute that largely to all of the work we did on the front end, engaging the community and incorporating their concerns.
Awesome. Tom, why don't you comment on what you're seeing on the other states and then maybe even at the federal level?
Yeah, so I think what you just heard is the reason why the states are the laboratories of democracy. I mean, you've got, frontline folks who need to find real-time solutions to these challenges, and these are not things that are happening like 20 years from now, they're happening now. And so the data kind of policies that need to evolve with technology need to be done at a localized level, and so that kind of community engagement is very important. Obviously, there are states, the challenge of that is there's a state-by-state patchwork that's being created in this context, and it's not necessarily consistent. And so whether you're a vendor, you're an operator, or you're a utility that operates in multiple jurisdictions, or you're a consumer, a company that has, that has operations in different parts of the country, you've got to now all of a sudden master all these, new complex, and changing dynamics. And so I think that issue, usually leads to some kind of federal solution, right? And so that is kind of, I think, where we're at the beginning phases of, and I think it's still quite early. And in fact, those of you who've been around this issue, and I actually come to this issue a little bit late, there was a lot of talk at the federal level back, almost a decade ago when we were talking about smart meter rollout and sort of some consistent federal frameworks for this. And it never really gravitated because it wasn't really ready. And that there was, you had to deploy the smart meters, you had to get them out, and then we're also now living in an age where data is so ubiquitous, as we talked about, and data is being generated in so many different ways that I think consumer expectations are changing in this. And so that leads to some changes that are going to force the states, frankly, and there's Illinois, there's California, Texas, they all have different models, and I'm not an expert on any one of them. They're certainly, but they all kind of gravitate around a few things. What does informed consent mean? Is it purpose specific? How do you standardize these consent processes in a way that makes it so that the vendors and the other third parties that are using this data or accessing this data are able to kind of utilize this data for their own business plan, but also in a way that protects the consumer. And so it's not something that is being utilized to harm the consumer or to kind of shop the consumer around. And then there's issues of cascading liability and things like this if you do have a problem with a data breach or a cyber event. Those are two tremendously risky things to have to manage, and I think that they won't be done in a static way. The states are going to have to kind of develop some real-time protocols for that, but there is going to need to be some consistency in this at the federal level. And the good news is, or the bad news, depending on your opinion, of where the federal government goes, is there are some ideas circulating in Congress in the context of the next climate bill, because as you talk about all these issues, you're going to have some data regimes in this to think these issues through and to kind of debate these things. So the year 2020, in my view, is kind of a year where at the federal level, we're going to start talking about these things in congressional hearings, as well as some protocols at DOE and other places to kind of look at information sharing, best practices, things that NARU can do maybe at a larger level. So there's a lot to be done, but again, it gets really granular fast, but you'll see consistencies across the states, and then you'll see where the differences are, and hopefully that will lead to some kind of idea for consensus going forward.
You can see the pendulum swing, though, right? There's a risk. There was a book recently released on AI superpowers, and that whoever controls data will really control the future economy. And so how do we find that balance between allowing innovation and disruption to occur, but at the same time being good stewards of the data? Like, where is that line?
So, I mean, that's the big question. I mean, and because we really haven't even grasped yet, certainly in Washington or beyond, the power of AI and what's happening right now in the economy. And I think that there is, what may look like a kind of a forward-looking regulation or requirement may be very outdated, simply by coders being able to codify some kind of algorithm that's going to make things different. And while you can solve, it's not all bad. I mean, AI and all these things can be used for good, and it can be used, this new sense of transparency, this kind of quantitative data that can be generated, not just from the consumer side, but from the industrial side. You've got the ability now, sensors are collecting data in the supply chain and able to kind of quantify their emission profiles in ways that used to be run by models. And so you have some real good opportunities to change the debate here. But at the same time, the question of what is the role for government, and is there one? I mean, and certainly there is one, but like, how do you set the parameters, and how do they remain relevant, frankly, is a very important question, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And I don't think folks, at least certainly from my new kind of evaluation of folks at the state level, both through the regulators and through the state legislators, it's a difficult thing for them to grasp, because they're all having to manage their day jobs, and now all of a sudden it's like they have to understand what algorithms are and data governance means to them as a policymaker, and it's a real challenge. So it's going to take some time and evolution, and that's what this next decade is going to really be about.
So Wendee, maybe something actionable for your colleagues. Where do people start? I mean, we talked earlier, there are standards on PII information, there's standards from NIST, but there's kind of this hodgepodge of info that's all surrounds, the common theme is data, but what kind of data? And so for utilities maybe who are just starting on this journey, what would be your recommendation, or lessons learned, or what were your whoopses? Anything that you want to add there?
Definitely engage the community, and I'll also say nobody's going to want to hear it, but because nobody at my company wanted to hear it. But the DataGuard program and a lot of the frameworks that are being passed, so I have reason to believe that if it hasn't come to your utility yet, it will, classifies meter number and usage information as PII. So whereas a decade ago, a utility collected very little PII and didn't have much of a risk for breach of customer information, addresses aren't PII, utility account number is not PII, and does anybody know if your state classifies a utility account number as PII? I don't think any of them do that I've seen. Usually it's just financial bank account numbers. So certainly if you have an auto debit, if your customers are set up on auto debit, that would be a breach if that information got out. But I don't think any states classify like the utility account number. So previously a bill was not PII. Well, now if you have your meter number on the bill, which we do, and I'm trying to get it taken off, because all of a sudden a misdirected bill could be a data breach. And that is showing up all across the country. So look out for that and manage expectations within your company that that might be a thing that you have to adopt. Your regulators might want you to adopt it and treat it that way. And that may, like I said, it may require some little business adjustments, like taking the meter number off of your bills that could better protect your company. But I think the biggest thing, the most helpful thing we did was engage our stakeholders and our customers very, very early.
Are you seeing any best practices or lessons learned for early starters?
I mean, I think the issue is still new to a lot of folks in Washington, and so I think we're looking to learn from the front lines right now about what's working and what's not working. So questions of liability, questions of who owns the data always kind of starts with that, and then people go into their boxes. There's consumer advocates who have some views, there's the utilities who have views, there's the vendors that have the views, and I think it's going to take time to kind of go through this process. And so Hawaii really being on the front line is a fascinating kind of experiment, just not just on the data side, but also on the DER side and what they're doing to kind of look at the model for the country and can that be replicated. So it's a little early, but then some of the ideas in DC, you can do some DOE best practices. You can look at some kind of model guidance for the states. Those are the kind of things that I think are being discussed right now that are not very prescriptive, bottoms-up approach. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of bottoms-up a mentality with the idea towards some kind of minimum standards or minimum frameworks is where this needs to go, but it's certainly not ready now.
Yeah.
And we did I'll add with the stakeholders, we engaged consultants that have been involved in the process in California and Illinois, and the DOE, who brought in lessons learned from both of those states and helped answer questions for our stakeholders on why certain decisions were made in the framework that we modeled ours after. So if there was a concern with a particular provision, they were able to help us explain to the stakeholders why it was the way it was or what the origin of that was, if it wasn't something that we drafted, but rather something we borrowed. So that can be helpful too if you're starting from scratch.
Any idea from a regulatory perspective, like who has this on their dockets? Or is it all?
I think everybody needs to be looking at this. I mean, whether you're an RTO, whether you're a PUC, whether you're a state legislator, whether you're a federal government, it really is, it covers all ends. And I think the more you silo it, the more you potentially limit the applicability of the data, because you don't, the jurisdictional boundaries, frankly, are a leading question here, because to get the scale you need to make the sense of this economically, you need that jurisdictional kind of overlap or not duplication, and you need to kind of be able to scale and pace this. And then when you take it up even a notch further in the global context, you've got AI and algorithms which know no boundaries. They know no jurisdictional boundaries. And so it's really kind of mind-blowing to think about this, where this could be going. There's a couple of reports that will, if you're interested in reading, to really show kind of where the new frontier of data is going. I'm happy to kind of share some of those with you after too, just because it does question how government is going to keep up. It's a real question.
So kind of teasing that out a little bit, if you take the prosumer thought process to an extreme, and they own the data, and that's been well documented. What if they are the ones who then start dictating how this gets laid out?
Yep.
Or who's allowed to append their data, or who's allowed to standardize it, or who's allowed to do anything? What if, can you imagine a world where, you know, we talk about bubbling up and grassroots, we've seen a lot of that this morning. What happens in those scenarios? And maybe you've seen that already, Wendee.
Yeah, so a lot of the framework borrows concepts from HIPAA, if anybody's familiar with HIPAA. But yes, so the customer can choose who gets their data, but there's also primary purposes listed, which are all of our business needs. And our business needs include using the data to promote energy efficiency programs. So if we want to offer rate designs, different rate designs, that type of thing, that's an energy efficiency program we can use interval usage data for, regardless of whether or not the customer has consented to that or opts out. We can use it, we can share it with our contractor who's helping us with that energy efficiency program. And if our PUC engages its own contractor through an order where they say Hawaii Energy, which they actually do, they're going to use Hawaii Energy, a third party, to collect the data from Hawaiian Electric and evaluate it and tell them how they could, what programs they could implement in order to make Hawaii's energy users more efficient. That's also a primary purpose that the customers do not have to consent to and cannot opt out of. So yes, they're the owners of the information, but there are a couple of primary purposes that just like your doctor can use your medical information, you can't prevent the hospital from using it to bill you or to bill your insurance company. You couldn't if you wanted to. And it's your question about amending it. Yes, we have something in there where they can amend it, but they can ask for an amendment if there's something incorrect. But I can look at that and determine whether or not it's a reasonable request, whether or not there is in fact something that's incorrect and should be amended to the data. It's the secondary purposes. It's the purposes that aren't for us operating our grid or promoting an energy efficiency program that we have to get customer consent for, or a vendor like Michele's company that wants the data to do something that the PUC hasn't specifically authorized. They would have to get customer consent. And they do that through the green button website page where the customer can go in and say, yes, I authorize this company. I want to participate in this program they're running where they're giving rebates for whatever product I can buy to make make myself more energy efficient. The customer consents to that. They can revoke their consent at any time. They have full control there, but that is never going to impact the control we have to use the data for our purposes, or the PUC has to authorize somebody to use the data.
And talk about the businesses, because I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, one thing we did differently in Hawaii than California and Illinois is we kind of altered the framework a little bit to only apply to residential customers. And the thinking there, before I went to Hawaiian Electric, I was in private practice applying all of these state statutes that Tom mentioned, which there's now over 50 of them, different ones, when you count the territories. And it's, none of them protect business data. Privacy data protection laws are always focused on consumer protection and the privacy of a person. So I felt that the frameworks in California and Illinois broadened what had been traditionally data protection laws that only applied to consumers by including business energy usage. So we made our framework apply just to residential customers, and we explained it that way to our stakeholders. Everybody seemed to understand that. I think there's also more potential in energy efficiency when you're looking at the downtown business customers, Waikiki business customers, that kind of thing. And it would be a shame to inadvertently prevent some of those uses by allowing overprotection that isn't generally offered to businesses. So we just didn't get much pushback, and so far so good. Like I said, it's still pending with our PUC, and hopefully I'm not asking for somebody to go and complain about it now, but businesses just don't seem to have the concerns that consumers do. So I think we're safe.
Yeah, and just adding on that, I mean, I think privacy and consumer data and kind of this whole digital revolution need to be part of the framework for climate policy, and privacy and cyber, or both, need to be kind of inherent in everything we think about now and how we frame the solution. And so, you know, there needs to be market rewards, market incentives for the most cyber secure products, for the most, you know, the products that protect the privacy without limiting the ability to have the innovation that allows it. And so these kind of third-party players who come in, you know, you know, an owner kind of comes in and says, I consent to give my data to someone, they don't necessarily understand that that third party may also be giving their data to other parties that are subcontractors to that party. And that's where the real kind of frustration comes in. It's a question of, you know, what did you sign up for? Is it authorized? Is it clear? Is it informed? Do you have the ability to revoke that? Those are the kind of things that are being discussed in different states and in different capitals right now. And I think they need to be kind of dynamic. They need to have the ability to, it needs to be a consumer-centric solution. I mean, it absolutely must put the consumer first. It must have the prosumer, you know, the ability to have this kind of new, bringing the power back to, you know, instead of you being commoditized by the data, you actually use your data to commoditize what the solution is that you want. You know, and you have this kind of power now that you didn't have even 10 years ago with these big new data solutions that are being done by third parties and by vendors, and that aren't necessarily the utilities who kind of are doing this kind of innovation. And so that opening up that door to that competition and to that ability to have them interweave their way into this is a really important part of this debate. And in some jurisdictions in the country, it's blocked entirely. So that's a whole other debate that we can get into. But it's a fascinating way of kind of real-time evolvingness of this issue. So.
I'm going to show my age with this question. So how much education is still required? Again, if we create kind of like a bubble up, you know, do we start working with residential customers so that they understand the power that they have at their fingertips and what we could all co-collaborate together? Or, you know, in a data sharing arrangement, is there some kind of sprint that we could do where we start informing them on, and start it from a value base rather than, you know, all the
risks, that
restrictions
challenges.
And, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you capture their imagination, I mean, I'll just start. I think anybody under the age of 40 kind of has a different perspective of this. You know, they put more data out there. They understand that they have a different level of privacy that they expect. Certainly, you know, Gen Z or you know, anybody below, you know, teens growing up right now, it's just going to be different. And so businesses need to prepare for that, and I think utilities need to prepare for that too. They're more engaged. They want to know where their electrons come from. They want to know how to save money. They want to know how to, you know, go green. So they have that power to do it through data and through their own meter data or through their ability to buy community solar through a data app now. You know, there's lots of new programs that are doing that. So I think if you put those solutions up front, they will trade off some of these challenges that they may fear are a little bit more in your face from kind of the previous generation, maybe. I don't know if you have any different thoughts on that, but so I think that is going to be why this next climate debate and the way we look at these things are going to be very different, because we didn't have this kind of ubiquitous data society that we live in now 10 years ago. I mean, the last time we debated climate policy in earnest was 2009 in Capitol Hill. So if you're looking at, you know, people talking about this issue again, all these issues are hugely ripe for, and again, not easily solvable, but it is a different debate, is my point. It's not quite the same kind of debate where we're talking about these top-down mandates. You're often looking at bottoms-up solutions that are coming from the states, that are coming from the consumers directly, or coming from new players in this world that didn't exist at all 5 years ago, even 10 years, but certainly not 10 years ago, but a lot of them not even 5 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I should amend my answer earlier when I said consumers don't have the ability to opt out of some uses. So far in Hawaii, smart meter adoption is voluntary, So the people who are still very resistant and scared of it don't have to have a smart meter unless there are some exceptions. We have a particularly high percentage of customers that have inaccessible meters, high fences and dogs and whatnot, because the theft on island is fairly high. And so we are starting a program where those customers are going to be forced to have smart meters. Anybody who has solar will also be forced to have a smart meter, so we can operate, the flow of electricity there. But other people who are scared of the hacking and the radio frequency and all of that kind of stuff wouldn't be forced into a situation where they wouldn't have the choice of how we use their data. Now, our smart meter rollout is relatively new, so I don't know yet how many people are going to resist smart meters. I don't have, it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 or 10 years if that's a significant portion of our consumers or if that's, 1 in 100 that are holdouts.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're still waiting to hear. But I will say if you're looking to roll them out, I would have data at your hands on RF and EMF and hacking, because those are the concerns you'll get. And there are plenty of websites out there that give them all the false information they need to cut and paste into a letter, cease and desist letter to send to your,
PUC.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, we wanted to give time for questions. Gentleman right there.
Sure, quick question. As I think, Tom, you talked about, things are evolving. What do customers want? Because this whole topic really depends upon where we're going, and I think that this is all driven by consumers.
Yeah.
As you think about the 2020 debate here in the Beltway and what's going on in the States, where are we going from the perspective of what are the customers, and there's C&I as well as residential, but where are we going from their perspective? Because we have to be mindful of that's what this is really all about.
Sure, and the platform that is the grid that is evolving, what the last 2 panels have been about is that exact question. I mean, what is this, who are we designing this for? We're designing it for customers. Customers' needs are becoming more transparent. They're becoming much more active in the system. They want choice more. They want choice of supplier. They want choice of electron if they can differentiate it, and those things certainly didn't exist, as 10 years ago. People would laugh if you even talked about those kind of things. But now it's kind of an expectation. So the customers' expectations are changing, and again, and that's the beauty of it. You can't speak for one customer. Everybody has their own unique spot here. So I think, a grid that gives that optionality is the grid of the future, and that's relying on data. It's really relying on data, and that's kind of becoming more of the backbone that people don't, I think, give enough credit to sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
Well said. Way in the back.
I think, Wendee, you mentioned the fact that if people could turn their devices, the TVs on and off on major problems, but I can control my HVAC system like everybody else. If a utility ran any of its systems over a public internet, they'd be laughed out of the PUC. But now we're allowing consumers to operate major devices over the public internet. And I'm concerned, my cyber people have always told me nothing goes over the public internet, but that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
You mean your HVAC system or your PV system?
I don't have a PV yet.
Yeah, I think, I don't have an HVAC system anymore. Because I don't need it.
My concern is that we're
It's the
allowing
security.
customers to use the public internet to
Yeah.
control major devices on a utility.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I think there's a difference in how it would affect our grid if to control an appliance versus to control a PV system. A lot of our customers, we've got whole neighborhoods that have bought in and have essentially and I can't remember the term, but a united grid where, they're a significant source of electricity during the day to our grid. And so if that whole thing went on or off or fluctuated in ways that we can't control or predict, it would cause us significant issues.
Historically, I remember there's one utility put in a time
Yeah.
And that's what I'm concerned about. The electric space heaters are 35 amps, and you spread that over a whole community, you can have problems.
Yeah, no, I agree. We don't have space heaters either, though.
But those are real issues, though.
But yeah, no, I understand that. I think that that's probably addressed by gradual rollout instead of everybody being on a time of use at once, which is at least how we're doing it.
There's no gradual rollout of mass thermostats.
Yeah. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, so to wrap, I think, key messages here. If you're a utility and you haven't started talking about how you protect data, start now. Engage all members and clearly experiment, because this is evolving and we can be co-creating together. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And talk to the experts. Yeah.
Thank you.